Consciousness is not where thinking happens. It is where thinking gets announced. Your brain decides first, then it tells you, and you call that moment being awake. Most of your mind runs in the dark. Billions of cells, sorting, weighing, choosing. You never meet them. You only meet the part that gets broadcast. That broadcast is you. A theory says that is all consciousness is. Not a glow, not a soul, a signal going live. Think about the last time a sound reached you late. Your name across a crowded room. For a moment, it was just noise. Then something flipped. The word arrived. You heard it. Nothing changed in the air. The sound was always there. What changed was inside your skull. A threshold was crossed. A switch was thrown. That switch has a name. Scientists call it ignition. And one theory says ignition is the whole story of your conscious life. It happens to you thousands of times a day. A pain you were ignoring suddenly owns you. A face in a crowd resolves into someone you know. The road in front of your car is there for an hour, unseen, until the brake lights flare and the world snaps into focus. Each time, something that was already in your brain finally goes live. You did not summon it. It arrived. Science has a problem with consciousness. It is the hardest problem it has. The problem is not where thoughts come from. We can trace those. The problem is why any of it is felt. Why there is something it is like to be you. A machine processes data and feels nothing. You process data, and a world appears. 3 answers have tried to close that gap. You have heard 2 of them here already. Some say consciousness is quantum, that it hides in tiny structures deep inside your neurons, below the reach of ordinary biology. We covered that. Your brain is an antenna. It is on the channel. Some say consciousness is a number, that you can measure it, that everything integrated enough has some of it. Integrated information theory. We covered that too. It is on the channel now. This is the 3rd answer. It does not look below the neuron. It does not reduce you to a number. It looks at the whole brain working and asks a colder question. Not what consciousness is, when it happens, and where. A neuroscientist named Stanislas Dehaene built the modern version of this. He works in Paris at the Collège de France. He does not chase the soul. He chases the signal. Where others ask what consciousness means, he asks what it does and where the brain does it. He wants a number on a screen, a wave on a chart, the moment marked. To him, a mystery you cannot measure is just a mystery you have not pinned down yet. The idea did not start with him. It started with a cognitive scientist named Bernard Bars in the 1980s. Bars used one image and it stuck. Picture a theater, a dark stage. Most of the actors wait in the wings, unseen. A single spotlight moves across the stage. Whatever it lands on becomes visible to the whole audience at once. The audience is the rest of your brain. The spotlight is attention. The stage is consciousness. And here is the claim. Almost everything in your mind happens off stage, in the dark. Only what the spotlight catches gets broadcast to the entire theater. Only that becomes conscious. Bars called it the global workspace. Dehaene gave it a body. He named the wiring, a network of neurons with long, far-reaching connections, dense in the front and upper regions of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex. Call it the workspace. It does not do the seeing or the hearing. It does the broadcasting. Here is how it works, and it is stranger than it sounds. A signal comes in, a face, a word, a pain. At first, it climbs quietly through your sensory cortex, local,
private, unconscious. Then one of two things happens. If the signal is weak, it fades. It stays in the dark. You never know it was there. But if the signal is strong enough, it crosses a threshold, and the workspace ignites. Ignition is not gentle. It is a sudden, brain-wide flare. The front and back of your brain lock into a loop, firing back and forth, amplifying the signal, holding it up, broadcasting it everywhere at once. That flare, the theory says, is the instant the signal becomes conscious. That flare is you noticing.
And it is all or none. This is the part that should unsettle you. Consciousness in this model has no dimmer. The signal either loses and stays dark, or wins, ignites, and floods your whole mind. There is no halfway. You are not a little bit aware of your name across the room. One instant it is noise. The next, it is everything. That threshold is ruthless. Two signals can be almost identical in strength. One falls just short and dies in silence. The other clears the bar by a hair, ignites, and becomes your entire world for a moment. A sliver of difference at the input. A canyon of difference in experience. Your conscious life runs on the wrong side of a cliff edge you never feel. And the stage is narrow. Only one broadcast can dominate at a time. That is why when two things happen a half second apart, the second can vanish completely. The workspace was still lit by the first. The spotlight cannot be in two places at once. What it does not catch, you do not live. So the claim is brutal and simple. Consciousness is not what you feel. It is what your brain chooses to broadcast to itself. Everything else, and there is so much else, happens in the dark, and you never know it was there. A theory that only tells a story is just a story. What lifts this one is that you can catch the flare in the act. Here is the experiment, run thousands of times. You flash a word on a screen. Sometimes you let the viewer see it, sometimes you hide it, surround it with other shapes, flash it for a handful of milliseconds. The eye still receives it. The viewer swears they saw nothing. Now watch the brain in both cases. When the word is hidden, activity rises in the visual cortex. The brain registers it. The signal is real. But it stays local. It climbs partway and dies in the dark. When the word is seen, something else happens. The same early activity rises. Then it explodes forward. It floods the prefrontal cortex. The parietal cortex lights up. The whole network ignites. The difference between unconscious and conscious is not a stronger eye. It is that second flood, the broadcast. And the flare has a fingerprint. Around 300 milliseconds after a signal becomes conscious, the brain produces a large, late electrical wave. You can read it off the scalp with electrodes. It shows up for sights, for sounds, in every paradigm they try. Dehaene calls signals like this the signatures of consciousness. A late wave, a frontal flood, a sudden global ignition. He laid them out in a book with a blunt title, Consciousness and the Brain. Now here is the detail that turns the screw. The hidden word, the one you swear you never saw, does not vanish. It works on you. Flash a word too fast to see, then ask a question, and your answers bend toward it. The buried word primes you. It shapes your choice. It just never becomes conscious. So the unconscious in this picture is not empty or asleep. It is awake, competent, deciding, and silent. It does everything, but tell you. This is why the theory is so hard to shake. The same flare, or its absence, can be hunted in people who cannot move or speak at all. Doctors listen for that late wave in patients locked behind a still face. When the signature fires, a mind may still be in there, broadcasting to itself, with no way to wave back. The broadcast, it seems, is the line between a person and an empty room. This is not philosophy anymore. This is a measurement, Show a person something they consciously see, and the signature appears. Hide it below the threshold, and the signature is gone, even though the eye caught it either way. Stay with me, because for the first time, you can watch a thought cross the line into awareness and mark the exact moment it does. That is a powerful thing to be able to see. It is the strongest case this theory has. So now we do the hard part. We test it. In 2023, consciousness science did something it had never done. It put two rival theories in a ring and forced them to fight, in public, with the rules agreed in advance. On one side, the theory we covered last time, integrated information theory, which says consciousness lives in the dense back of the brain. On the other side, this one, the global workspace, which says consciousness is a broadcast from the front. Same labs, same subjects, same scans. Neither camp could move the goalposts after the results came in. Here is what they left out of the headlines. The workspace theory did not win either. It predicted a sharp ignition in the front of the brain when an image entered awareness. Some of that showed up. Conscious content really could be read out of the prefrontal cortex. That is a point for the theory, but the prediction was more specific. It expected a second flare when the image disappeared, a clear marker at the moment experience ended. That flare did not arrive as promised. So the front of the brain mattered, but not in the clean way the theory required. One of its boldest predictions came back wounded. If this sounds like a defeat, it gets worse, because the same experiment bruised the rival theory too. Neither one walked away whole. That is not failure. That is the field finally doing what it could never do before, making a theory commit in advance and letting reality answer back. Now we have to be honest. And this is where we stop selling you the theory and show you the case against it. Because the objection to the global workspace is not small, it may be the deepest objection in all of consciousness science. Take the strongest version of it from a philosopher named Ned Block. Block draws a line between two things we lazily call one word. There is access, the information your brain can broadcast, report, act on, remember. And there is experience, the raw feel of the red, the sting of the pain, the warmth of the light. Block calls them access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Here is the charge. The global workspace explains access beautifully. It tells you exactly how a signal becomes available to the rest of your brain. But availability is not feeling. A theory of what gets broadcast is not yet a theory of why the broadcast is experienced from the inside. The flare tells you that a signal went global. It does not tell you why going global should feel like anything at all. And there is evidence behind the worry, not just argument. Your experience seems to overflow what you can report. Look at a crowded scene. You feel like you see all of it richly at once, but you can only report a sliver. If consciousness is only what gets broadcast and reported, where does the rest of that richness go? Maybe you are conscious of far more than the workspace ever lights up. There is more. The theory leans hard on the front of the brain, but when surgeons stimulate the prefrontal cortex directly, the regions the workspace says are central, people often report no change in their experience at all. And some scientists argue that the famous late wave, the signature, is not the mark of consciousness itself. It may be the mark of what comes after. The brain noticing, deciding, preparing to report. Strip away the report, and part of the signature fades, which raises a brutal possibility. The workspace may not be measuring consciousness. It may be measuring the moment you get ready to talk about it. A rival camp pushes the experience back into the senses themselves. They say a local loop in your visual cortex, firing back on itself, is already enough to feel something, with no broadcast required. In that picture, the front of the brain is not where consciousness lives. It is just where consciousness gets put to use. The feeling is already there, in the back, before anything ignites. The workspace only shows up to take notes. And underneath all of it sits the oldest objection of all. Even if the theory is perfect, even if it predicted every flare to the millisecond, it would tell you when a signal becomes conscious, and where and how it spreads. It would still not tell you why any of that is felt from the inside. Why a brain-wide broadcast should come with an experience attached, instead of running in total darkness like the rest of the machine. The workspace maps the easy mystery in stunning detail. The hard one, the why, it leaves exactly where it found it. We are not telling you who is right. No one knows who is right. That is the honest state of the science. The workspace gives the clearest, most testable account of how information goes global in your brain, and it may still be answering the wrong question. But sit with what happens if it is even partly right, because it reaches straight into you. Right now, you feel like the author of your thoughts. You decide, then you act. That is the order it seems to come in. The workspace reverses it. The deciding happens first, in the dark, across networks you never see. The conscious feeling, the flare, arrives after. You are not the room where the choice is made. You are the press release. Your sense of being a single, continuous self may be the broadcast doing its job, pulling scattered, unconscious processes into one stream, holding them up, and labeling the bulletin. You. Not the source of the thought, the announcement of it, always a step behind the brain that made you. Think about what that does to free will. You feel the choice as you make it, but the workspace says the machinery already moved, in the dark, before the flare reached you. The feeling of choosing is real. It just arrives after the fact, like a headline printed once the vote is counted. You are informed of your decisions. You do not attend them. And it means most of your mind is a stranger to you. For every signal that ignites, countless others rise, do their work, and die without ever reaching the stage. They steer you, they never introduce themselves. The you that feels in charge is standing in a single lit room, in a building with 1,000 dark ones, certain it has seen the whole house. You think you are watching your life as it happens. You may be watching a summary already written of a decision already made. That 2023 experiment had two theories in the ring. We have now stood in both corners, the number and the broadcast, the back of the brain and the front. And that closes a circle on this channel. 3 answers to one impossible question. Consciousness as quantum. Consciousness as a number. Consciousness as a broadcast. The antenna, the measure, and the workspace. They cannot all be right. They might all be wrong. That is what makes this the last real frontier. If you have followed all 3, you have seen the whole battlefield now. The quantum answer and the mathematical answer are both on the channel, waiting. Watch them back to back, and you will understand consciousness science better than most people who study it. Subscribe and hit the bell. This question is not closed, and when the next piece breaks, you will be the first to see it. If this made you think, send it to someone who is sure they are in control of their own mind. Let them sit with it. And tell me one thing in the comments. If your brain decides before you do, and the conscious you is only the announcement, then where are you in that picture? The decider in the dark? Or the bulletin that arrives too late? Look at the next thought that crosses your mind. You did not write it. You received it. It ignited somewhere you cannot see, and only then did it reach the stage, into the light, where the thing you call you was waiting to be told. So ask yourself the only question that matters now. If you are always the last to know what your own brain has chosen, then who exactly is doing the choosing? And if it is not the part of you reading this, then how much of your life have you actually been present for? This is Codex Origin. Stay strange.